I think I love Booktube. At the end of the day, after we eat our dinner, to sit and rest, to experience somebody else's point of view, to laugh, to cry, to get angry, and yes, to even listen to old people talk about sex in books. Hi, I'm Leah, and welcome to Hide and Seek, and welcome to the My Pleasures book tag, Australian edition. I was kindly tagged by the wonderful Steve Partridge, the creator of this tag. Steve's dry British sense of humour transplanted into Berlin is some of my favourite ways to spend my Booktube time. I also strongly urge you to go and check out Matthew from MCS Books response tag as well. His videos are both delightful and insightful, and this one is no exception. On to the tags. The first prompt of Think, a book that made you think hard. Now I am going to choose The Hate Race by Maxine Beneba Clark, an Australian author and beat poet of African parentage. Now Ms. Clark and I grew up in Sydney at around the same time and in around the same place. And so the touchstones and milestones and locations of her childhood mirrored mine quite nicely. However, it was heartbreaking to sense my idyllic, boring, middle-class childhood reflected back to me through the filter of racism. It was simultaneously heartbreaking, harrowing, yet hilarious. If you want a memoir, a coming-of-age story, a sense of change and social change, then this may just be the book for you. Ms. Clark is also very active on social media, so I will link her Twitter feed down below as well. The second prompt, The Prompt of Love, a book that mended or broke your heart. I'm going to go with the modern Australian historical fiction, family saga, complete drama, The Thorn by Colin McCulloch. This is my sweet spot for historical fiction, a huge sweeping family saga. It tells of love, of familial love, of fraternal love, of forbidden love. I love the sweeping story through the generations. I love the sweeping landscapes that transverse from New Zealand to Australia to the Australian outback. I loved the whole story. It is a modern and masterful classic piece of Australiana. It tells of a time and place through history. It doesn't hurt that it is set primarily not too far from where I live, and so the landscape, the people, the places are very familiar to me. I have not read any other of Ms. McCulloch's works, and I'm not sure I want to. I've heard mixed reviews about them, and I would rather leave my impression of her untainted and just don't go anywhere near the horrendous 1980s miniseries of the same name. The third prompt, The Prompt to Eat, a book that nourishes you. I'm going to choose Ellen van Neerven, Comfort Food, a collection of Australian poetry. I love this book. Now, it doesn't hurt that the title is Comfort Food. However, Miss van Neerven is a poet who, in this collection, is bringing the notion of food through to community. She ties food back to the sense of home, the sense of cultural identity, all through the filter of being an Aboriginal woman. It is a wonderful story of finding your story, wonderful collection of poems about finding your place in community, about responding to the factions going around you. I just love this collection. Now, you can often find these thin University of Queensland Press collections of poetry, and I pick them up when I find them. So any of them would be nourishing to my soul as an Australian. However, this particular one based on food is fantastic. Now, Ms. van Neerven is also one of the judges of this year's Stella Prize, and I like her work and I do watch out for her quite frequently on all the social media channels. The fourth prompt of Laugh. Now, rack off you moles or we will have a scrag fight. I am going to talk about my favourite book from my teenage years, Puberty Blues by Lette. Now, during the 80s, this book was scandalous. Now, today, it's probably only even mildly distasteful. However, at the time, I had to hide it from my mother because it was just abysmal and scandalous in her mind. It is such an Australian take on the bogan coastal lifestyle, and I'm probably using words you don't understand. It is just full of hilarious Australianisms. I've often thought I should do a video on Australian slang because sometimes I worry that you don't understand some of the turns of phrase I use. So if you'd like a video on Australian slang, let me know down below. But this is a crack up and you cannot tell me otherwise. The fifth prompt, the prompt of sex. Now I'm going to go for two partners in this story. Now the first book I want to talk about isn't technically Australian, it is New Zealand, but that counts because this book is significantly underrepresented on Booktube, and I have spoken of it before. Witi, Ihimeara, the Uncle's Story. Now this tells of dual timelines, modern day New Zealand, paralleled to Vietnam War era New Zealand. And it tells of the coming out story of a Maori man in today's culture, and then how that parallels through his family background. Now it tells a wonderful story of the warrior culture of the Maoris and how being gay is just not acceptable in any way. This is a heart-wrenching story. It tackles the sexuality of First Peoples nations across the world, and I can't use words here. Just read this damn book. I loved it, and not enough people know about it. The Uncle's Story from Witi, Ihimeara. This is the third copy of this book I have ever bought because I keep lending it to people and it never comes back. So it is fantastic. Just read it. I have no other words. The second book I want to talk about to this prompt, and I have spoken of this book in the past on my channel, Danger Music by Eddie Ayres. Now, Eddie Ayres was Emma Ayres, and she was a presenter on our national radio program before taking a teaching position in the National Institute of Music in Kabul, Afghanistan. And this is the story of not just Emma at the time's experience as a teacher of music in Afghanistan, but also her coming to the realization that she is no longer her and she, and the transition that Emma makes to become Eddie, and this is his story. And I loved this book. Not enough people have read this book. It is a wonderful story, not necessarily of Australia, but by an Australian, and a wonderful story. Just read this memoir. The sixth prompt of rest. Now, my copy of this book is somewhere in this house and I cannot find it. It is Storm Boy by Colin Thiele, illustrated by Robert Ingpen, an Australian children's classic that I read and was read to as a child. I have the first edition because that's how old I am. The imagery is magnificent. It tells the story of a lost boy and his love for a bird, a pelican called Mr. Percival. It tells of his story and his relationship with a local Aboriginal man. It is just a beautiful, softly, tranquil story about Australia, and I just loved the childhood imagery. It transports me straight back to the 70s and 80s and having it read to me by my parents. The imagery is fantastic, and I think it has just had its 40th anniversary release recently, and it is beautiful. It is restful, and I love this book. Now, the final prompt, the prompt of experience, is one I'm going to talk about, a book that changed my point of view. And I've spoken about Australia and our discussion lately with respect to bringing migrants to Australia, and in particular refugees to Australia. And the story I want to talk about is Songs of a War Boy by Deng Adut. Now, Deng Adut spoke at my son's school. I've spoken of the book signings that he has, and yes, I have another autographed copy. My son's school often has male authors come and speak each term. This tells the story of a young boy who was kidnapped in South Sudan and was put into the children's army there, and the harrowing story of his life. And then the transition from that to becoming finally a refugee here in Australia, and how from that the experience of being a refugee who spoke no English and being a very black man in Australia during a time when racism is just abysmal, and how now he studied from no English and now has a law degree. He won the New South Wales Australian of the Year nomination last year, 2017. An amazing story from an amazing man. This was one of the books that I read in the car whilst John was driving, and he's talking to me and I'm going, shh, can't talk, must read. This book changed my life, and it gave me an experience of understanding more about the refugee process and putting a face to the awful stories that you hear about refugees. And it's a great way to see why people want to come to our beautiful and wonderful country. So there is the My Pleasures tag. To tag Roz from Book Your Imagination, Cara from the Wilde Book Garden, and Paulina from Superpower. So I look forward to your responses, ladies, but thank you for watching and have a fabulous day.